Welcome back. Today it's about my top 10 favorite biographies, books I've read and loved. I love the genre of the biography very much. I read lots of them, not just on pop culture related subjects. This video, I think, is going to be more about the pop culture focused biographies, but I also read lots of historical biographies, like, for example, Roman emperors and stuff like that. I just like to read about someone else's life and the mistakes someone makes, but also the successes and the whole drama of that. And I'm not going to differentiate for this video, for the purpose of this video, between autobiography and biography. And also I'm not going to exclude unauthorized, it's authorized, unauthorized autobiographies, just biographies, it's all that stuff. First is the dishonorable mention, because I just released my autobiography, or it's a biography, a journalist wrote it with me together, so it's half. Is it an autobiography, is it a biography? Journalist wrote this with me, and it was released a couple of weeks ago. Very successful, so I'm very happy about that. I think most of you don't know this about me, because I never mention it, but I work in the music business, if you can call it business, here in Austria, in the small country I'm from. And I'm managing artists, bands, I'm a music publisher and so on. And this book is about my life, and especially the parts of my life that are connected with those artists I worked with. It's really just interesting for people who are into Austrian pop music, so it's probably you're not the target audience if you're not one of my few viewers from Austria or Germany. But that's a dishonorable mention, because I can't really rank myself in this. But this was the reason for this video, for the idea for this video, so because my mind was on the topic for so long now. I was thinking about what makes a good biography, what's not so good. I'm not going to say that I succeeded with it with my book, but I thought about all those things, and that's why I came up with this ranking today. The top 10, my number 10 is Chronicles Volume 1, the Bob Dylan autobiography, or the first part of it. There's rumors, or maybe even a bit more than rumors even, that he kind of finished Volume 2 now, over 10 or maybe 15 years after Volume 1 came out. It's maybe it's a bit of a too big task he made himself when he thought, I'm going to write about all my life in several parts, because when it took him 15 years to come up with the second part, we will never get a real full autobiography of the whole career of Bob Dylan, because in this book, for example, which is the only that's out so far, and which is great, that's why it's number 10, but it only tackles on some stories of his life. This is really about like 2 or 3 phases of his career, of 2 or 3 very distinct 2 to 3, 4, 5 year phases. So it's far from a comprehensive picture of everything he did, and so Volume 2 will maybe add a couple of other aspects of his career, but he would have to become like 150 years of age to really make the complete thing. But this is still very, very interesting. It's only number 10 because it's just of such a small scale, so it's not really about, if you want to find out about his whole life and career, this is not the right book. But those 3 or 4 eras of his life, it's really good to have him in his own words, in his own very poetic, as we all know, words, reflect on that, and therefore it's a really brilliantly written book, and I can't wait for Volume 2. Number 9, one of my biggest obsessions in terms of pop culture is Brigitte Bardot, and this is her autobiography. I have the German translated version because I read this first when I was like 10 years old, when I wasn't reading English books by then. I read in German, of course. I don't even know if this is available in English language. It's certainly, the original is in French, of course, since she's from France. It's probably also translated into English, and it's very fascinating. Her view of her own life and career, which has some very controversial aspects to it, but also it's really a story of pop culture in the 20th century from a French perspective in a way. She was there in the 50s, when rock and roll was invented, or in France the Nouvelle Vague movie movement was kind of started. She was there in the 60s, 70s. This book is from like when she was born in 1934 until the mid 70s when she stopped her acting career. There's a second part that I never read about the time after that, which focuses, I guess, more on her, her charitable work for animal welfare. Maybe one day I'll read it, because this was really very nicely written, Brigitte Bardot's autobiography. The next one is a band that's in the news very often at the moment, because they reformed, at least as a live group, so as far as we can tell, Oasis. This is the book about their rise to fame in the 90s. It's really it goes up until summer 1996. It's German, because again I bought this when I was like 12 or 13 years old when this came out. This came really out in the 90s when the thing was still happening. It's up until 1996, and I think it came out in 1997, 1998. So it's really a book about the rise of someone, working class lads making it big in the rock and roll business, and very inspiring book. That really inspired me to a lot of things. Also the things that led to the things that are going on in this book. By the way, so yeah, that's for inspirational reasons, but also the way it is written by Paolo Hewitt. It's really also very greatly written. It's a really fascinating story. There's a lot of passion, it's written with a lot of passion. Number 7, Under the Ivy. This is one of the more recent ones. This one I purchased and read last year, I think, in 2024. It's an unauthorized biography on Kate Bush, but it's a very respectful, it's coming from a hardcore fan, and people from the Bush family and so on, associates of her, work closely with the author. She's just not the type of person who wants to, do long interviews about herself. She's really about her own mystique. It's about her own mystique. And the book, the great thing about this book is it doesn't really try in a like a yellow press kind of manner, like to dig into the mystique. This is a book that celebrates the mystique, but still it's so rewarding, insightful. You learn so much about her and her upbringing, her life, her artistry. And as a Kate Bush fan, this is a very fascinating book. It's really kind of impossible to write a better book about Kate Bush than this book, I think, unless she decides to write one herself. Number 6 is one of the most classic rock and roll autobiographies of all time, maybe the number 1 in terms of notoriety. It's Life by Keith Richards, and everything everyone says or thinks about this book, in my opinion, is correct. This is really a rock and roll book. This doesn't hold back. This is really a gritty retelling of maybe the greatest rock and roll story ever, rock and roll group story ever. And yeah, fantastic stories and also funny. This is really how you should do an autobiography if you're a rock star. Number 5, again, is a biography and not an autobiography, but with in this case, with lots of cooperation by the star. The star is Neil Young, and the book is called Shakey. A couple of years later, Neil Young really made an autobiography, which I also read and also like, but I prefer this book, which was written by a fan, Jimmy McDonough, and it's based on many, must have been many hours of interviews with Neil Young. So it's, in a way, it's Neil Young telling his story, but it's it's kind of curated by the author, and yeah, it's also kind of best possible book about Neil Young and all this, the scenes he was part of, like the scene with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Joni Mitchell, that Valley scene in the late 60s, but also the the things he did in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So, it's such a vast life story. That's also important for a good biography. Isn't how it's written, it's also about, is the life, interesting enough? And he's one of those people with a very, very interesting life with lots of ups and downs, but it's also written brilliantly. So that's the best combination, Shakey, about Neil Young. Next one is maybe a bit of a surprise. It's not about a musician, it's about an actor. And you don't go into reading this book thinking this will be a big revelation, or this will be like, wow, one of the best books I've ever read. It's not the kind of guy where you think that this is even possible. But it's Michael J. Fox autobiography. I mean, he did several editions now, and he did a couple of books after that were also very highly regarded and successful. But this is really the core autobiography of his life, of his acting career, also about the Parkinson disease thing, of course. And this is, I didn't expect when I started reading this, but this was one of the most emotionally moving books I've ever read. There were a couple of things in there that got me crying. It was so brilliantly told, and he has such a fantastic way to talk about all, especially the darker, the sadder things of his story. Such a aspirational kind of way of looking at things, but also the funny stuff, or the parts where it's about his success, of his rise to fame in the 80s. It's so fun. It's written so funnily, but still, those darker, sadder moments. I rarely have read a book that got me more emotional than this book, Lucky Man by Michael J. Fox. Number 3 is now a tie of several books, because, as you know, I'm such a big Beatle fan. I can't have one book about the Beatles as their best Beatle biography. Maybe to many of you surprising, my favorite book about the Beatles when they were active as the Beatles is their own authorized book, the Beatles anthology book. I think many people, especially those who haven't actually read it, maybe think, this is going to be a superficial book, it's the official sanitized story, and it's more like a coffee table book with lots of pictures in it. But when I read it, about the time when it came out, I was really surprised how deep it goes. There are certain aspects that are sanitized, of course. You won't get some stories from them themselves. But the important stuff, that the vibe of the whole Beatles experience is really, it comes to life in this book. And it's basically, the anthology documentary as a book, but much larger. They gave so many hours of interviews for the anthology, and I don't know, maybe 20 or 30% of what they said on interview for the anthology was used in the TV documentary. But this is really, with all the outtakes, so to speak, this is probably maybe 80 or 90% of all the things they said in those interviews. So it's like there's lots of repetition, things you will be familiar with exactly word per word from the documentary, the TV documentary, but it goes so much deeper. It's so much more, side stories in there, and it's told by them, and it's told, very endearingly and funnily, and it's a great book if you're, this book manages to be a great book for casual fans or starters, people who don't know yet much about the Beatles story. But it's also very rewarding for a Beatle hardcore fan like myself, great book. But my favorite book, my all-time favorite book about the Beatles focuses on the time after the anthology. This is about when they were active, and my favorite Beatle book, I can't show it to you because I borrowed it to someone like 10 years ago and I never got it back. I even forgotten who the person is that has my book still. It's You Never Give Me Your Money by Peter Doggett, which is about, You Never Give Me Your Money begins when the anthology book ends. This begins like in the early 70s. I mean, it begins in the late 60s, but it's really about what happened after the split of the Beatles. And it's, that this is really more for hardcore fans than for casual fans, of course. But this is one of the most interesting things I've ever read. And even I learned so much new information in this book about the Beatles through that excellent Peter Doggett book, and a book, books that were the sources to Peter Doggett's book are also some of my favorite Beatle books. One is the most controversial. This is a German translation, but this is the infamous Albert Goldman John Lennon book. Very controversial. Everyone who had anything to do with John Lennon, it came out after his death, said this is bullshit, this book. But they said they didn't like this book, people like Yoko Ono, Paul McCartney, etc., because maybe it contains some hurtful truths in a way. I don't say that everything in this book is gospel. Albert Goldman really sometimes he goes over the top, but it's really a greatly researched book, and some of the real darker aspects of John Lennon's life, whether you like it or not, he researched those things. There are sources to most of his claims, and most of his claims, I have to say, are kind of true. And it's, you can either decide that all your idols are like saints or martyrs, or you can go the way and say, I want to know more about the human being, and human beings have light sides and dark sides. And this book also, of course, it's not just the dark sides, it's also the dark sides. It's infamous because it was one of the first that really went deeply into the dark aspects of the whole Beatle experience and John Lennon's life. But it also tells you the good things as well. So it's not like this is just about being nasty to John or to Beatle fans. It's it tries to give you a complete understanding of who that person was, and for the most part I think it succeeds. And I think Peter Doggett, whose book is very acclaimed, he took so much from source material from this book. So when people say that Peter Doggett book is so great and the Albert Goldman book is rubbish, they should look at Peter Doggett's sources, and lots of the John Lennon stories that Peter Doggett tells are just retellings of the stories Albert Goldman, first discovered with his book. Another book that's also kind of in the Peter Doggett or maybe even Albert Goldman style of writing is my favorite George Harrison biography by Graham Thompson, Behind That Locked Door. Again, this is a book that that gives you a balanced view of George Harrison with all the brights and positive sides, but also it also critiques where critique is due, and it doesn't shy away from also the darker sides maybe. But it's a great read again, this book. And for Paul McCartney, sorry Ringo fans, no Ringo book. For the Paul McCartney fans, I went with the McCartney Legacy so far. This is an ongoing project. We have Volume 1 and Volume 2. But unlike with Bob Dylan, I expect them to finish the job, because they put this out like 5 years ago and this like 2 years ago. And with this book, they're already in the year 1980. So I think they probably need 2, at maximum 3 more volumes. So maybe in 10 years we have like a 4 or 5 volume McCartney Legacy, and this is really, you can tell it by how big these books are. This really goes into deep, nerdy territory, and for hardcore fans this is an essential read. If you're not just Paul McCartney, but maybe also if you're just a Beatle hardcore fan, this is really an interesting book. My number 2 book I don't have as a physical book, because I just have it on my Kindle. I read it as an ebook. It's by my fellow Austrian Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's his autobiography, Total Recall. That's that's one of the, next to the Beatles, probably the most interesting and fascinating pop culture story of the 20th century. Brigitte Bardot, the Beatles, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Those are books that really tell you not just about those artists, but if you can call Arnold an artist, maybe he's more of a businessman, but they really are retelling of of the interesting aspects of things that happened between like 1940 and 2000. So if you're also a kind of pop history geek in general and not just a fan of those people, those lives really are very interesting in terms of understanding, the 20th century or the second half of the 20th century in pop cultural terms. And Arnold's story is, of course, one of the wildest of them all. And my number one book is not pop culture related. I read lots of historical books and biographies because I'm interested in that. But for the most part, I wanted to focus on pop culture with this video because the channel is about that. But I couldn't leave this book out, and if I don't leave it out, this has to be my number one. It's the most entertaining biography I've ever read, and one of the most entertaining books in general I've ever read. It's on Captain Cook. It's by Tony Horowitz. It's a book about the British explorer James Cook, who discovered Australia, for the British at least, who did some of the most adventurous journeys ever, and the way it's told is so entertaining. This is really a masterpiece of writing by Tony Horowitz, and it's there's one pop cultural aspect to this book as well. It's my number one, and it would probably also be, if you ask Mick Jagger, Life by Keith Richards, unsurprisingly, wouldn't be Mick Jagger's number one because Keith isn't always very nice to Mick in his book. But Mick Jagger was once asked about his favorite books, and he mentioned this book of all books. So Mick Jagger is also a big fan of this book, and yeah, he's right. This is a fantastic book, Cook by Tony Horowitz. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.